The crushing pain in my chest hit at 3:47 a.m., like someone had placed a vice around my heart and was slowly tightening it with each labored breath I tried to take. I'd been an emergency room nurse for 28 years before my own heart problems forced me into early retirement, so I knew the difference between anxiety and the real thing. This was the real thing. I lay in my bed for 15 minutes, hoping the pain would subside, that maybe I was wrong about what was happening to my body. But the crushing sensation only intensified, radiating down my left arm with a familiar pattern that made my blood run cold. When I tried to sit up, the room spun violently, and I could barely catch my breath. At 52, I was having a heart attack. My hands shook as I reached for my phone on the nightstand, scrolling through contacts for my son Ethan's number. The twins were 36 now, both successful in their careers, both living in expensive downtown apartments about 20 minutes from my modest suburban home. They'd been the center of my universe since the day I'd held them as newborns, when I was barely 17 years old and terrified about raising two babies completely alone. "Ethan?" I managed to whisper when he answered on the fourth ring, his voice groggy and irritated. "Mom, do you have any idea what time it is? It's almost 4 a.m. Ethan, I need you to drive me to the hospital. I'm having chest pain and I can barely breathe." "What?" I heard rustling in the background, probably him checking his phone for the time again. "Mom, you've had anxiety attacks before. Remember last year when you thought you were having a stroke but it was just stress? This isn't anxiety, sweetheart. This is different. I need to get to the emergency room right now. Mom, I have a major presentation tomorrow morning. Today morning. I've been preparing for this client meeting for weeks, and I can't show up exhausted and unfocused." The pain in my chest intensified as I processed what my son was saying. His presentation was more important than his mother's potential medical emergency. "Ethan, please, I'm scared, and I don't think I should drive myself." "Look, Mom, just call an Uber. It'll probably be faster than waiting for me to get dressed and drive over there anyway. And honestly, you know how you get worked up about health stuff sometimes. An Uber? Yeah, they run all night, and you'll get there quicker than if I have to come pick you up first. Text me when you get to the hospital, okay? But try to get some rest if it turns out to be nothing serious." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at my phone in disbelief, wondering if I'd actually heard my son correctly. Had he really just told me to take a rideshare to the hospital during what felt like a massive cardiac event? My finger hovered over Isabella's contact information. Bella had always been slightly more empathetic than her twin brother, though both of my children had grown increasingly distant since achieving financial success. Maybe she'd understand the urgency of the situation. "Mom?" Bella's voice was sharp with annoyance when she answered. "What's wrong? It's 4 a.m. Bella, I need you to take me to the hospital. I'm having severe chest pain and shortness of breath. I think I'm having a heart attack." "Oh, come on, Mom. Remember the last few times you thought you were having medical emergencies? It was always anxiety or acid reflux or something minor. This feels different, sweetheart. The pain is radiating down my arm and I can barely stand up. Have you tried taking some antacids? Sometimes what feels like chest pain is actually just stomach upset. You had that spicy Thai food yesterday, remember?" I closed my eyes and tried to stay calm despite the mounting panic I felt about both my physical condition and my children's responses. "Bella, I was a nurse for almost 30 years. I know the difference between heartburn and cardiac symptoms." "Right. But you also know that stress can mimic heart attack symptoms, and you've been anxious about everything lately. Look, I have a huge product launch meeting first thing tomorrow, and I literally cannot afford to be running on no sleep. So you want me to drive myself to the hospital? God, no, don't drive if you're feeling dizzy. Just call an Uber or a cab. They'll get you there safely, and then you can text me when you find out it's nothing serious." "An Uber," I repeated flatly. "Mom, it's 2024. People use rideshare services for hospital trips all the time. It's actually more practical than having family members drive you, because then we don't have to worry about getting two cars home from the hospital. What if it's nothing serious, Bella? Then you'll be at the hospital getting treated by professionals who actually know what they're doing. Mom, I love you, but you're not thinking clearly right now. Just get to the emergency room, let the doctors check you out, and call us in the morning with an update." She hung up before I could argue further. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in my trembling hands, trying to process what had just happened. Both of my children, The two human beings I'd sacrificed everything for worked double shifts to support, stayed up all night nursing through childhood illnesses, had just told me to take an Uber to the hospital during what might be a life-threatening medical emergency. The crushing chest pain was getting worse, and I was starting to feel nauseated and lightheaded. Every instinct I'd developed as an emergency room nurse told me that I was experiencing a major cardiac event that required immediate medical intervention. I opened the Uber app with shaking fingers and requested a ride to St. Mary's Hospital, the same emergency room where I'd worked for over 2 decades. The estimated arrival time was 8 minutes, which felt like an eternity when every breath was a struggle. As I waited, I thought about all the times I'd dropped everything to rush to my children's sides when they needed me. Ethan's broken arm when he was 12. I'd left work in the middle of my shift to be with him. Bella's appendicitis at 15. I'd spent 3 days sleeping in an uncomfortable hospital chair to make sure she wasn't alone during her recovery. But now, when their mother was potentially dying, they couldn't be bothered to miss a few hours of sleep before their important work meetings. The Uber driver was a kind Pakistani man named Ahmad, who helped me into his car and drove carefully but quickly to the hospital, asking if I needed him to call anyone or stay with me until I was admitted. "My children know I'm coming," I told him, which was technically true, even though neither of them planned to join me. Ahmad insisted on helping me into the emergency room and wouldn't accept payment for the ride. "My mother is same age as you," he said gently. "I hope someone helps her if she needs hospital and I cannot be there." I checked in at the emergency desk, where I recognized several nurses from my years working there. The triage nurse immediately noted my symptoms and vital signs, and within 10 minutes, I was in an examination room having an EKG performed. That's when I saw the name on the cardiologist's coat who walked into my room, and my world shifted in a way that had nothing to do with my cardiac emergency. Dr. Colin Matthews, the same Colin Matthews who'd gotten me pregnant when we were both 16 years old. The same Colin Matthews who'd disappeared from my life when his wealthy doctor parents forced him to choose between me and his future medical career. The same Colin Matthews I'd loved desperately and had spent 36 years trying to forget. The father of my children, who had no idea that the scared teenager he'd abandoned had given birth to twins who just refused to help their mother during the most terrifying night of her life. Some medical emergencies bring families together. Mine was about to reveal that the father my children had never known was about to save their mother's life while they slept peacefully in their beds, prioritizing work meetings over the woman who'd raised them alone for 36 years. And Dr. Colin Matthews was about to discover that the great love of his life had been lying alone in an emergency room, abandoned by the children he'd never met. Dr. Colin Matthews stood frozen in the doorway of my examination room for what felt like an eternity, his medical chart falling from suddenly nerveless fingers as recognition dawned across features that had matured from the boyish face I'd loved at 16 into the distinguished countenance of a successful cardiologist. "Victoria?" His voice was barely a whisper, filled with disbelief and something that sounded almost like relief. "Victoria Ashworth?" "Hello, Colin." I managed to keep my voice steady, despite the chaos of emotions competing with the physical pain still crushing my chest. "I go by Tori now." He moved closer to my hospital bed, with the cautious steps of someone approaching a mirage that might disappear if disturbed. His eyes, still the same warm brown that had once made my teenage heart flutter, searched my face with an intensity that made me acutely aware of how much 36 years had changed both of us. "I've been looking for you," he said quietly, pulling up the chair beside my bed with hands that trembled slightly. "For over 3 decades, I've been trying to find you." "Have you?" I replied, noting how his wedding ring finger was bare, but choosing not to comment on that observation. "Well, you found me, though I assume you're here in a professional capacity rather than as part of some long-term search effort. Tori, you're having a heart attack." His voice shifted into clinical mode, though his eyes remained fixed on my face with unmistakable emotion. "The EKG shows significant ST elevation, which means we need to get you into surgery immediately." I know what ST elevation means, Colin. I was an emergency room nurse for 28 years. You became a nurse. A small smile crossed his face despite the medical crisis at hand. "You always said you wanted to help people who were hurt." "Yes, well, I learned early that some people don't have anyone else to help them. The pointed reference to my situation 36 years ago made him flinch, but before he could respond, another cardiologist entered the room. "Dr. Matthews, the surgical team is ready for your MI patient," announced Dr. Peterson, a colleague I vaguely remembered from my nursing days. "We need to move quickly on this one." "Dr. Peterson, I need you to take over this case," Colin said without taking his eyes off me. "I have a personal connection to this patient that creates a conflict of interest." "Colin, there's no time for case transfers," I interrupted, my chest pain intensifying with each word. "You're the best cardiologist in this hospital, and I need the best right now. Tori, I can't operate on you. The emotional stakes are too high." The emotional stakes were high 36 years ago too, but that didn't stop you from making practical decisions then. He winced at my words, but I could see him weighing medical necessity against personal complications. "She's right," Dr. Peterson interjected, checking his watch. "Dr. Matthews, you're the most experienced surgeon available, and this patient needs intervention within the next 20 minutes, or she could suffer irreversible cardiac damage." "Fine," Colin said, standing and switching fully into surgeon mode. "But I want Dr. Peterson assisting, and I want complete documentation of all decisions made during this procedure." As they prepared to wheel me into surgery, Colin leaned close to my ear. "Tori, I need to ask you something that might sound strange given our circumstances." "What? Do you have children? Is there family I should contact about your surgery?" I looked into his eyes, the eyes that had passed genetically to both Ethan and Isabella, and made a decision that would change all of our lives irrevocably. "I have twins, Ethan and Isabella Ashworth. They're 36 years old." Colin's face went completely white as he processed the mathematics of what I'd just told him. 36 years old, he repeated slowly. "Yes? Tori, are they—" "They're your children, Colin. The babies I was carrying when you left for medical school in the UK. I watched a man who'd spent decades performing life-saving surgery under intense pressure completely fall apart emotionally as he realized that the teenage girlfriend he'd abandoned had been pregnant with his children." "I have children?" His voice cracked with a mixture of joy and devastation. "I have 36-year-old children that I've never met? You have children who've spent their entire lives wondering why their father never cared enough to find them. Tori, I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know you were pregnant. I tried to tell you. I called your house dozens of times, but your parents said you'd made it clear you didn't want any contact with me." "That's not true. I never said that. My parents, they told me you'd moved on and didn't want to see me anymore." "Well, we can sort out who lied to whom 36 years ago after you saved my life." Dr. Peterson was growing impatient with our conversation. "Dr. Matthews, we really need to move this patient into surgery immediately." "Where are they?" Colin asked urgently as the orderlies prepared to wheel my gurney toward the operating room. "Where are Ethan and Isabella? Are they here?" "No, they're not here." "Why aren't they here? Don't they know you're having a heart attack?" "They know. And they're not here?" "They told me to take an Uber because they have important work meetings in the morning." I watched Colin's face cycle through shock, disbelief, and what appeared to be anger as he processed what I'd just revealed about our children's response to my medical emergency. "They told you to take an Uber to the hospital during a heart attack because they had work meetings? Apparently their professional obligations take precedence over their mother's potential death. Give me their phone numbers." "Colin, you need to operate on me first. The emotional family reunion can happen after you've prevented me from dying." "You're not going to die, Tori. I'm not going to lose you again. You lost me 36 years ago when you chose your medical career over our relationship. Right now, I need you to use that medical career to save my life." As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I could see Colin struggling with the devastating realization that he'd missed 36 years of his children's lives, and that those children had just abandoned their mother during a life-threatening emergency. "Tori, after the surgery, we need to talk about everything. After the surgery, you need to call your children and explain to them that their mother almost died alone because they couldn't be bothered to drive her to the hospital." "My children," he repeated softly, as if testing how the words felt. "Your children who don't know you exist and who apparently don't value the parent they do know. Some people discover their parents through planned announcements or happy accidents. Colin Matthews was discovering he was a father while preparing emergency surgery on the woman who'd carried his children alone for 9 months and raised them alone for 36 years. And those children were about to learn that the father they'd never met was about to save the mother they'd just abandoned while they slept peacefully in their beds, dreaming about tomorrow's work presentations. I woke up 6 hours later in the cardiac intensive care unit with the kind of disorientation that follows major surgery and heavy anesthesia. The steady beeping of monitors and the familiar antiseptic smell of hospital air brought back memories of my nursing career, but seeing the world from a patient's perspective felt surreal and vulnerable. "Tori?" Colin's voice came from somewhere to my right, gentle but alert. "How are you feeling?" I turned my head slowly, noting the IV lines and monitoring wires attached to my body, and saw him sitting beside my bed, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His surgical scrubs had been replaced by wrinkled street clothes, suggesting he'd been here for hours. "Like I've been hit by a truck that was carrying surgical instruments," I managed, my throat dry and scratchy from the breathing tube they'd used during surgery. "That's actually a pretty accurate description of what happened to you." He reached for a cup of ice chips from my bedside table. "Here, this will help with the throat irritation." "How bad was it?" "Bad enough. You had what we call a widowmaker heart attack, a complete blockage of your left anterior descending artery. If you'd waited much longer to get medical attention, I'd be dead." Yes, I let that information settle while I tried to process everything that had led to this moment. The crushing chest pain, my children's dismissive responses, the Uber ride with kind Ahmad, and the shocking revelation that my emergency surgeon was the father of my children. "Colin, have you called them yet? Ethan and Isabella?" "No, I wanted to wait until after your surgery when I could tell them you were stable." "What exactly are you planning to tell them?" "The truth, that their mother had a massive heart attack, that she almost died because they refused to bring her to the hospital, and that I'm their father." "You're going to drop all of that information on them in one phone call? How would you prefer I handle it, Tori? These are extraordinary circumstances requiring immediate honesty." I closed my eyes, trying to imagine how my children would react to learning that their absent father was not only alive, but had just performed life-saving surgery on their mother while they slept through her medical crisis. "They're going to be devastated about not being here," I said. "Good. They should be devastated. Colin, they're not bad people. They've just become self-absorbed as they've gotten older and more successful. Self-absorbed enough to tell their mother to take an Uber during a heart attack. Their father abandoned them before they were born. Maybe they learned emotional detachment from that experience." The comment hit its mark, and I watched Colin's face crumple with guilt and regret. "Tori, I didn't abandon you by choice. My parents threatened to cut off all financial support for medical school if I didn't end our relationship immediately. They said you were a distraction that would destroy my future. And you believed them? I was 18 years old and terrified about losing my chance to become a doctor. My parents convinced me that staying with you would ruin both our lives. So you chose your career over our relationship and our children. I chose what I thought was financial security that would eventually allow me to provide for you properly. I planned to come back for you after medical school. But you never did, because when I tried to find you, you disappeared. Your mother had moved and left no forwarding address. I hired private investigators, searched social media, checked nursing school records. Nothing. I remembered my mother's decision to move us across the country when the twins were 2 years old, claiming she wanted a fresh start away from painful memories and local gossip about her teenage daughter's situation. My mother thought it was better if we made a clean break from everything that reminded us of our old life, including me, especially you. We sat in silence for several minutes, both processing 36 years of missed connections and misunderstood intentions. "Colin, what do you want from me now? From us? I want to know my children. I want to understand the people they've become and try to build relationships with them. And what about me? What about you? Do you want to build a relationship with me or just with the children we share?" He was quiet for a long time, studying my face with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "Tori, I've thought about you every day for 36 years. I've wondered where you were, whether you were happy, whether you ever thought about me. Finding you here, learning about our children, it feels like I've been given a second chance I don't deserve. That's not an answer to my question. I want everything. I want to know you again. I want to know our children. I want to be part of the family I should have been part of all along." It doesn't work that way, Colin. You can't just insert yourself into lives that have been functioning without you for decades. I understand that, but I'm hoping you'll give me the chance to try. Before I could respond, a nurse entered to check my vital signs and adjust my medication. I recognized her as someone I'd worked with years ago, and she seemed surprised to see me as a patient rather than a colleague. "Tori, I heard you were here but couldn't believe it. How are you feeling, honey?" "Like I've been reminded that I'm not invincible, Sarah. Dr. Matthews here saved your life. You're lucky he was on call tonight." Sarah finished her checks and left, but her comment about luck made me think about the extraordinary coincidence of Colin being my attending physician during the most vulnerable moment of my adult life. "Colin, I need you to understand something before you call my children." "What?" "I don't want them to feel obligated to have a relationship with you out of guilt about not being here tonight. If you're going to be in their lives, it should be because they genuinely want to know you, not because they're trying to compensate for abandoning me during a medical emergency." How do we separate those motivations? We don't tell them you're their father until after they've had time to process their guilt about tonight and decide what kind of relationship they want with me moving forward. You want me to lie to them about my identity? I want you to introduce yourself as my doctor who's concerned about their absence during my surgery. Let them deal with the immediate crisis first. And then we see whether they're capable of being better children before we complicate their lives with information about their father. Tori, they deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know the truth about a lot of things, including how to prioritize family over work meetings. Let's see if they can learn that lesson before we add more complexity to their emotional education. Colin looked conflicted, but nodded slowly. "All right. I'll call them as their mother's doctor, who's concerned about their absence. But I won't wait long before telling them everything else." "Fair enough." He picked up his phone and scrolled through the contact information I'd given him hours earlier. "Any preference for which one I call first?" "Ethan. He's usually more practical in crisis situations. Some phone calls deliver routine updates about medical procedures." The call Colin was about to make would begin a series of revelations that would force my children to confront both their failures as family members and the existence of a father they'd spent their entire lives wondering about. And I was about to discover whether my children were capable of genuine remorse or just performance-based guilt management. Colin dialed Ethan's number at 11:30 a.m., giving my children plenty of time to wake up, attend their important morning meetings, and settle into their normal Tuesday routine before discovering that their mother had nearly died while they slept. I watched him pace beside my hospital bed, clearly nervous about the conversation he was about to have with the son he'd never met. "Mr. Ashworth, this is Dr. Colin Matthews at St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling about your mother, Victoria Ashworth." Even from my bed, I could hear Ethan's voice rise in alarm through the phone speaker. "Is everything all right? I was planning to call her later today to check on how she was feeling." "Mr. Ashworth, your mother had a massive heart attack early this morning. She underwent emergency cardiac surgery and is currently stable in our intensive care unit." The silence on Ethan's end of the call stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "A heart attack?" His voice had dropped to a whisper. "But she called me this morning about chest pain, and I thought—" "You thought what, Mr. Ashworth?" "I thought she was having anxiety issues like she's had before. She said she needed me to drive her to the hospital, but I told her to call an Uber because I had a presentation this morning." "You told your mother to take a rideshare service to the hospital during a cardiac emergency?" "I didn't know it was a cardiac emergency. She's had false alarms before, and I had this huge client meeting that I've been preparing for weeks." "Mr. Ashworth, your mother arrived at our emergency room alone at 4:15 a.m. She was having a complete blockage of her left anterior descending artery, which we call a widowmaker heart attack. If she had waited even another hour for treatment, she would have died." I could hear Ethan's breathing becoming rapid and shallow through the phone. "Oh God, oh my God, is she going to be okay?" "She's stable now, but she's been asking for you and your sister. I'm concerned that neither of her children has come to the hospital during the 10 hours since her surgery." 10 hours? She's been there for 10 hours? "Yes, Mr. Ashworth. Where are you currently?" I'm at work. I just finished my presentation. Dr. Matthews, I had no idea she was actually having a heart attack. She's called us about medical concerns. Before that turned out to be nothing serious." "When was the last time your mother called you about medical concerns that turned out to be nothing serious?" Another long pause. I can't think of a specific instance, but she worries about her health sometimes, and we just assumed." "You assumed that her chest pain and difficulty breathing were anxiety rather than seeking medical evaluation?" "Dr. Matthews, I feel terrible about this. I'm leaving work right now to come to the hospital. I think that would be appropriate. I'd also suggest calling your sister immediately. Yes, absolutely. I'll call Bella right now. Mr. Ashworth, I need to ask you something else. How would you describe your relationship with your mother? My relationship? We have a good relationship. Why are you asking? Because I'm concerned about her emotional welfare, as well as her physical recovery. She seems quite isolated, and strong family support significantly improves cardiac recovery outcomes. She's not isolated. We talk to her regularly. When was the last time you spent extended time with your mother? Not a phone call, but actual in-person time together? I watched Colin's face tighten with what appeared to be anger as he waited for Ethan's response. We had dinner with her it was probably around Thanksgiving, maybe a little before that. That was 4 months ago, Mr. Ashworth. We've been really busy with work, and Mom understands that we have demanding careers. Busy enough that neither of you could drive her to the hospital during what she told you was a medical emergency? Dr. Matthews, I understand you're upset about our response, but we genuinely thought she was overreacting to anxiety symptoms, based on what medical training or previous experience. We just know Mom tends to worry about her health. Mr. Ashworth, your mother was an emergency room nurse for 28 years. She has more medical training than most people to distinguish between anxiety and cardiac symptoms. Did you consider that when you dismissed her concerns? She was a nurse? You didn't know your mother was a nurse for nearly 3 decades? I mean, yes, I knew she worked in healthcare, but I didn't realize. I thought she worked in administration or something. Colin looked at me with an expression of disbelief. Mr. Ashworth, I'm going to give you your mother's room information. I suggest you and your sister come here immediately to discuss her recovery plan and your family's approach to providing appropriate support during her rehabilitation. Of course, yes, we'll be there as soon as possible. Colin ended the call and turned to face me with a mixture of anger and sadness. Tori, your son didn't even know you were a nurse. He thought you worked in healthcare administration. They've never shown much interest in my professional background. How is that possible? You dedicated your career to saving people's lives, and your own children don't know basic facts about your work history? They know I worked in healthcare. The specific details never seemed important to them. Everything about your life should be important to them. Colin's phone rang almost immediately. Ethan calling back. Dr. Matthews, I just spoke to my sister Bella, and she's leaving work now too. We should both be at the hospital within 30 minutes. Good. I'll be here when you arrive. Dr. Matthews, can I ask, how serious is Mom's condition? I mean, long-term? That depends significantly on several factors, including her compliance with cardiac rehabilitation, lifestyle modifications, and the quality of family support she receives during recovery. What kind of family support? Emotional support, practical assistance, regular check-ins, help with medical appointments and medication management, modification of living situations if necessary. Modification of living situations? Your mother lives alone, correct? Yes. Cardiac patients who live alone have significantly higher rates of complications and readmission. She may need someone staying with her during the initial recovery period. Oh, we hadn't thought about that. Mr. Ashworth, what did you and your sister think about when you learned your mother was having a heart attack? We thought about getting to the hospital as quickly as possible. What did you think about during the 10 hours before I called you? Silence. Mr. Ashworth? We didn't know she was having surgery. We thought she was probably being treated for anxiety or acid reflux and would be home by morning. So neither of you called the hospital to check on her condition? No, we assumed she would call us when she was ready to come home. You assumed your mother would call you for a ride home from the hospital after you'd refused to drive her there during her emergency? Dr. Matthews, we realize now that we made terrible decisions. We want to make this right. I hope so, Mr. Ashworth. I'll see you in 30 minutes. As Colin ended the second call, I could see him struggling to contain his emotions about the children he was meeting through the worst possible circumstances. Tori, how did we raise children who could be so callous toward their mother? We didn't raise them, Colin. I raised them. Alone. And apparently I didn't do a very good job. This isn't your fault, isn't it? Maybe if they'd had a father, they would have learned better values about family responsibility. Or maybe they just need to be reminded that their mother is a person who deserves love and respect regardless of their career priorities. Some family reunions happen during happy occasions, like graduations or weddings. Our family reunion was happening in a cardiac intensive care unit, where two successful adults were about to meet the father they'd never known, while confronting their failure to support the mother who'd sacrificed everything for them. And Colin Matthews was about to meet the children he'd dreamed about for 36 years, under circumstances that revealed them to be exactly the kind of people he'd spent his medical career trying not to become. Ethan and Isabella arrived at the hospital 28 minutes later, and I could hear their voices in the hallway outside my ICU room before they entered. Sharp, anxious tones mixed with what sounded like sibling arguments about blame and responsibility. "This is your fault, Ethan," Bella was saying as they approached my door. "You're older. You should have insisted we take her seriously." "My fault? You told her to try antacids and blamed her Thai food. Don't put this all on me." "Both of you need to stop arguing about fault and focus on supporting your mother." Colin's voice cut through their bickering with the authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. They entered my room looking like polished professionals who'd been suddenly thrust into an emotional situation they hadn't prepared for. Ethan wore his expensive charcoal suit from his morning presentation, while Bella had clearly rushed from work in her designer dress and heels, her usually perfect hair slightly disheveled from stress. "Mom?" Bella's voice cracked when she saw me connected to monitors and IV lines. "Oh my God, Mom, we're so sorry." Ethan stood frozen at the foot of my bed, his face pale as he took in the reality of how close he'd come to losing his mother while he delivered his client presentation. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly, his usual confidence replaced by obvious guilt and uncertainty. "Like I've been reminded that I'm mortal," I replied, studying their faces and noting how young they looked despite being successful 36-year-old adults. "And like I've learned some interesting things about my family's priorities." "Mom, we feel terrible about not bringing you to the hospital," Bella said, moving closer to my bed and reaching for my hand. "We honestly thought you were having anxiety symptoms. Based on what evidence? You've seemed stressed lately, and you've mentioned feeling worried about your health before." "When have I mentioned feeling worried about my health?" Bella and Ethan exchanged glances, apparently unable to cite specific instances of their mother expressing hypochondriacal concerns. "We just assumed," Ethan began. "You assumed wrong," Colin interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of anger that made both my children look at him with surprise. "Your mother is a trained emergency room nurse with 28 years of experience. She knows the difference between anxiety and cardiac symptoms." "Dr. Matthews," Bella said carefully, "we appreciate your medical care for our mother, but we're trying to have a family conversation." "This is a family conversation, Ms. Ashworth. I'm concerned about the level of support your mother will receive during her recovery, based on what I've observed about your family dynamics." "What exactly have you observed?" Ethan demanded, his defensive tone suggesting he didn't appreciate being criticized by a stranger. "I've observed that neither of you knew your mother was an emergency room nurse for nearly 3 decades. I've observed that you told her to take a rideshare to the hospital during what she clearly described as cardiac symptoms. I've observed that neither of you called to check on her condition during the 10 hours she spent in surgery and recovery." "We didn't know she was in surgery," Bella protested, "because neither of you called the hospital to inquire about her status after refusing to bring her here." "Dr. Matthews," Ethan said, his voice rising with irritation, "I understand you're concerned about Mom's welfare, but you don't know our family situation well enough to make judgments about our relationships, don't I?" Something in Colin's tone made both my children stop arguing and look at him more carefully. "What does that mean?" Bella asked. "It means that I've been observing your family dynamics for longer than you might think." I could see Colin struggling with his promise to wait before revealing his identity, but the anger he felt about my children's behavior was clearly overwhelming his patience. "Dr. Matthews," I said carefully, "perhaps we should focus on my medical recovery plan rather than analyzing family relationships." "Should we, Tori?" he replied, using my name with a familiarity that made both Ethan and Bella look between us with confusion. "Should we focus on medical treatment while ignoring the emotional factors that significantly impact cardiac recovery outcomes?" "Tori?" Ethan repeated. "Dr. Matthews, how do you know our mother well enough to use her nickname?" Colin looked at me, silently asking for permission to reveal what he'd been holding back for the past few hours. I nodded slowly, realizing that the truth was going to come out whether I wanted it to or not. "I know your mother because I've known her for 37 years, Colin said quietly, since we were both 16 years old. 16 years old? Bella's voice was barely a whisper. Your mother and I were close when we were teenagers. Very close. I watched my children's faces as they began to process the implications of what they were hearing. How close? Ethan asked, though his expression suggested he was already beginning to understand. Close enough that when I left for medical school in the UK, I had no idea she was pregnant with twins. The silence in the room was deafening. Bella sank into the chair beside my bed, her face completely white, while Ethan gripped the footrail of my hospital bed so tightly his knuckles turned pale. Pregnant with twins, Bella repeated slowly. Yes, 36 years ago. Yes. You're saying you're our father? Ethan's voice was barely audible. I'm saying I'm the boy who loved your mother desperately and was forced by my parents to choose between her and my medical education. I chose medical school, not knowing that decision meant abandoning two children I didn't know existed. You didn't know Mom was pregnant? Bella whispered. I didn't know. My parents convinced me that your mother had moved on and didn't want contact with me. When I returned from medical school, she disappeared completely. She moved us to California when we were 2, Ethan said, as if talking to himself, which is why I could never find you. I watched my children struggle to absorb information that was rewriting their understanding of their family history, their absent father, and the mother they just abandoned during a medical crisis. So you're our father, Bella said, and you just saved our mother's life while we told her to take an Uber to the hospital. That's correct. And you've been looking for us for 36 years, every single day. Ethan looked at me with an expression of devastation that encompassed both guilt about his recent behavior and shock about his father's identity. Mom, why didn't you ever tell us he was looking for us? Because I didn't know he was looking for us. I thought he'd made his choice and moved on with his life. I never moved on, Colin said quietly. I've spent 36 years wondering about the children I lost and the woman I loved. The woman you loved? Bella asked, looking between Colin and me. Still love, Colin corrected. Still wonder about every day. Still regret leaving more than any other decision I've ever made. So, what happens now? Ethan asked, his voice shaking. We've just learned our father exists, that he's been looking for us our entire lives, and that he saved Mom's life while you were prioritizing work meetings over family emergencies. I finished gently. How do we fix this? Bella asked, tears streaming down her face. How do we make up for being such terrible children when our father appears to be exactly the kind of person we should have learned to be? Some family revelations bring people together through shared joy and excitement. Our family revelation was forcing my children to confront their failures as human beings, while meeting the father whose absence had apparently taught them nothing about the value of showing up when people need you. And Colin Matthews was discovering that the children he dreamed about for 36 years had turned out to be exactly the kind of people who abandon their mothers during medical emergencies. The question now was whether any of us could figure out how to build authentic relationships from such a foundation of mutual disappointment and missed opportunities. The silence in my ICU room stretched for several minutes as my children processed the enormity of what they'd just learned, while Colin studied the faces of the son and daughter he was seeing for the first time in their lives. You have my eyes, he said finally, looking at Ethan. And you have your mother's stubborn chin, he added, turning to Bella. I can't believe you're real, Bella whispered, wiping tears from her cheeks. We used to make up stories about you when we were little. We imagined you were a pilot or a soldier or an explorer who was traveling the world. You thought about me? Every day, Ethan said quietly. We used to wonder if you knew we existed, if you ever thought about us, if you would want to meet us if you could. I thought about you every single day, Colin replied, his voice thick with emotion. I imagined what you looked like, what your voices sounded like, what you were interested in, whether you were happy. Or, we weren't always happy, Bella admitted. It was hard growing up without a father, especially when other kids asked questions about why we didn't have one. What did you tell them? That our father was away and couldn't be with us, I answered for them. I never wanted them to feel abandoned or unwanted, so I told them their father loved them but couldn't be part of their lives. Did you believe that? Colin asked me. I wanted to believe it. It was easier than explaining that their father had chosen his career over his family. I didn't choose my career over our family, Tori. I didn't know we were a family, But you chose your career over me. I chose what I thought was a future that would eventually allow me to provide for you properly. And when you finished medical school, when you had that future you'd been working toward, Colin's face fell as he realized the flaw in his long-term planning. When I finished medical school, I couldn't find you. You'd moved across the country with no forwarding address. Because I'd spent 4 years raising twins alone while you studied abroad, and I'd given up hope that you were ever coming back. I watched my children follow this conversation like spectators at a tennis match, trying to understand the complex dynamics between their parents while processing their own guilt about the events of the past 12 hours. Mom, Ethan interrupted, can we talk about what happened this morning? About us not bringing you to the hospital? What about it? We want to understand why we reacted the way we did. You reacted the way you did because you've learned to prioritize your professional obligations over family relationships. But we love you, Bella protested. Do you? Or do you love the idea of having a mother who doesn't interfere with your busy lives? That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time either of you called me just to talk, not because you needed something or felt obligated to check in? Bella and Ethan exchanged glances, apparently unable to answer my question. When was the last time either of you invited me to dinner at your apartments or suggested we spend time together doing something you enjoy? We invited you to Christmas dinner, Ethan said defensively. You invited me to bring side dishes to Christmas dinner at Bella's apartment, where I spent 4 hours cooking and cleaning while you both worked on your phones and complained about having to take time off work for the holidays. We didn't complain. You spent the entire meal discussing deadlines and client meetings instead of having conversations about family, relationships, or anything meaningful. We're sorry, Bella said quietly. We didn't realize we were making you feel unimportant. You weren't making me feel unimportant. You were treating me as unimportant. Colin had been listening to this exchange with growing anger and sadness. How long has this been going on? He asked me. How long has what been going on? How long have they been treating you like an obligation rather than their mother? Since they became financially successful and decided that family relationships were inconvenient distractions from their career goals. That's not true, Ethan protested. Really? When was the last time you called me because you missed talking to me, not because you felt guilty about not calling? I don't understand the difference. The difference is motivation. Do you call me because you enjoy our conversations? Or do you call me because you think good children are supposed to maintain regular contact with their mothers? I'm not sure. That's the problem, Ethan. You're not sure whether you actually want a relationship with me or just think you should have one. Colin stood up from his chair and moved to the window, apparently struggling to control his emotions. Tori, I spent 36 years dreaming about the family I'd missed. I imagined holidays together, conversations about their achievements, sharing their milestones and disappointments. And what are you thinking now that you've met them? I'm thinking that I missed their entire emotional development, and somehow they learned to view relationships as secondary to professional success. Hey, Bella said, her voice rising with hurt. That's not entirely fair. We're successful people with demanding careers. So is your mother, Colin replied sharply. She spent 28 years saving other people's lives while raising you alone, and you didn't even know what her job was. We knew she worked in healthcare. You knew she worked in healthcare the same way you might know a casual acquaintance's job. You never asked about her daily experiences, her challenges, her achievements, or her feelings about her work, because she never talked about work when she came home, Ethan said. Did you ever ask her about work when she came home? Silence. Did you ever ask her about anything when she came home, or were you too busy with homework, friends, and your own activities? We were kids. You've been adults for 18 years. What's your excuse for the past 18 years? I could see my children struggling with questions they'd apparently never considered about their relationship with me and their general approach to family connections. Dr. Matthews, Bella said carefully, what are you hoping for from us? What kind of relationship do you want to have? I want to know you. I want to understand who you've become, what you care about, what brings you joy and what worries you. And what about Mom? What kind of relationship do you want with her? Colin looked at me with an expression that was equal parts love, regret, and hope. I want whatever relationship your mother is comfortable giving me. If she'll let me be part of her life as a friend who helps with her recovery, I'll be grateful. If she's willing to explore whether we can rebuild something romantic after 36 years apart, I'd be honored. And if she doesn't want either of those things, Then I'll respect her decision and focus on trying to be the father I should have been to you. What does that mean? Ethan asked. It means learning to prioritize relationships over career advancement. It means showing up when people need me, even when it's inconvenient. It means understanding that love requires presence, not just good intentions. Some father-child meetings involve shared interests, similar personalities, and immediate connection. Our father-child meeting was involving a cardiologist lecturing his newly discovered adult children about family values while their mother recovered from a heart attack they'd ignored because of work meetings. And all of us were beginning to understand that building authentic relationships would require confronting 36 years of missed opportunities and some very recent failures of character that couldn't be fixed with apologies alone. Over the next 3 days, my hospital room became an unlikely family headquarters where 36 years of separation and several decades of emotional dysfunction were being slowly and painfully addressed. Colin had arranged his schedule to spend maximum time overseeing my recovery, while Ethan and Bella had both taken time off work, something that seemed to shock them more than it shocked me. I've never taken a personal day for a family situation, Bella admitted on Wednesday afternoon as she helped me eat lunch. I always thought family emergencies were something that happened to other people with less organized lives. And now? Now I realize I've been incredibly naive about what actually matters. Ethan was sitting in the chair by my window, reading through printouts of cardiac rehabilitation information with the same intensity he usually reserved for legal briefs. Mom, did you know that family support is one of the strongest predictors of recovery success after heart surgery? I was an ER nurse for 28 years, sweetheart. I'm familiar with recovery statistics. But you didn't tell us that our support would impact your medical outcomes. Would it have mattered if I had? He was quiet for a long time before answering. Honestly, probably not. I would have assumed you were being dramatic about needing help. Why would you assume that? Because I've gotten used to thinking of you as someone who manages fine on her own and doesn't really need us for anything important. The honesty in his admission was both heartbreaking and encouraging. Ethan, I've been managing fine on my own because I learned not to expect help, not because I didn't want or need family support. What do you mean? I mean that I stopped asking for things because I got tired of being disappointed when you were too busy to provide them. Bella looked up from the magazine she'd been pretending to read. When did you stop asking for things? Gradually, over several years. First, I stopped asking for help with household projects because you always had work conflicts. Then, I stopped suggesting family activities because you never had time. Eventually, I stopped sharing problems or concerns because you seemed annoyed by anything that wasn't positive news. We seemed annoyed? You would listen politely and then offer quick solutions that didn't require any involvement on your part, like suggesting I hire professionals or join community groups. Because we wanted to help you solve problems efficiently, Ethan said defensively. You wanted to solve problems quickly so you could get back to your own activities without feeling guilty about not helping personally. My children exchanged glances that suggested they were recognizing patterns in their behavior that they'd never consciously acknowledged. Mom, what would have been different if we'd been more available? Bella asked. I would have had people to talk to when I was worried about my health. I would have had help with home maintenance so small problems didn't become expensive emergencies. I would have had family members who knew enough about my daily life to recognize when something was seriously wrong. Like yesterday morning when you called about chest pain. If you'd been more involved in my life, you would have known that I don't call about medical concerns unless they're legitimate. You would have known that as a former ER nurse, I can distinguish between anxiety and cardiac symptoms. Colin entered my room carrying coffee for everyone and medical updates about my recovery progress. How are we doing today? He asked, settling into his usual chair beside my bed. We're having some overdue conversations about family dynamics, I replied. Good conversations or difficult conversation? Both. Colin distributed coffee while observing the subdued mood in the room. Ethan, Bella, how are you processing everything that's happened this week? It's overwhelming, Bella said honestly. Learning that you exist, realizing how badly we handled Mom's emergency, understanding how disconnected we've become as a family. It's a lot to absorb. What's been the most difficult part? Recognizing that we've become the kind of people who abandon our mother during a medical crisis, Ethan said quietly. And realizing that we became those people gradually, through thousands of small decisions to prioritize everything else over family relationships. What's been the most surprising part? Learning that you've been looking for us our entire lives, Bella replied. We always assumed our father had moved on and forgotten about us. Never for a single day. What would you have wanted our childhoods to look like if you'd been there? Ethan asked. Colin considered the question carefully before responding. I would have wanted to be present for your achievements and your disappointments. I would have wanted to help with homework, attend school events, teach you things I knew, learn about things you were interested in. What kinds of things would you have taught us? Medical knowledge, obviously, but also how to prioritize relationships over professional success, how to show up for people when they need you, how to recognize that love requires presence rather than just good intentions. Those are exactly the lessons we failed to learn, Bella observed sadly. You can still learn them. Being 36 doesn't mean you can't change your approach to relationships. How do we change patterns we've been following for decades? By making different choices starting now. By treating your mother like someone whose welfare matters more than your work deadlines. By showing up when she needs you instead of suggesting solutions that don't require your personal involvement. And what about our relationship with you? Ethan asked. How do we build a father-son relationship at 36? Slowly and honestly. I want to know who you are now, not who I imagined you might be. I want to understand your interests, your values, your concerns about the future. What if you don't like who we are now? What if you don't like who I am now? Are you worried about that? I'm terrified about that. I've spent 36 years idealizing the children I lost. The reality is probably more complicated than my fantasies. What were your fantasies? That you would be kind, compassionate people who understood the importance of family relationships and treating others with dignity and respect. Bella flinched at the implicit criticism. And what's the reality? The reality is that you're successful professionals who've learned to compartmentalize emotions and prioritize efficiency over empathy. But you're also people who are capable of recognizing your mistakes and wanting to change. Is that enough to build relationships on? It's a better foundation than many families have. I listened to Colin and my children navigate these conversations with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The intellectual understanding of our problems was encouraging, but intellectual understanding didn't necessarily translate into behavioral change. Colin, I said, what happens when I'm discharged from the hospital? How do we test whether these insights translate into different choices in real life? What do you mean? I mean that it's easy to be attentive and thoughtful when someone is in the ICU after a heart attack. The real test is whether that attention continues when I'm home, healthy, and not in crisis. What would continued attention look like? Bella asked. Regular communication that isn't prompted by guilt or obligation. Invitations to spend time together because you enjoy my company. Offers to help with practical matters because you care about my welfare, not because you think good children are supposed to provide assistance. How will we know if our motivations are genuine or just guilt-based? Time will tell. Guilt-based attention tends to fade as the crisis that prompted it becomes a memory. Genuine care tends to deepen as relationships become more authentic. Some families use medical crises as wake-up calls that strengthen their connections permanently. Other families experience temporary guilt-based improvement that gradually returns to previous patterns once the crisis passes. We were about to discover which kind of family we were capable of becoming, and whether 36 years of missed opportunities could be transformed into genuine relationships based on presence, respect, and authentic love rather than obligation and convenience. The real test would begin when I left the hospital and returned to normal life with children who were promising to be different and a newly rediscovered father who wanted to build something real from decades of regret and lost time. 3 weeks after my discharge from the hospital, I was sitting in my living room watching Colin teach Ethan how to replace the broken faucet in my kitchen, while Bella organized my medications according to the cardiac recovery schedule we'd developed together. This scene would have been unimaginable a month ago, but it had become our new Saturday afternoon routine. Dad, I think you're tightening that too much, Ethan said, using the word dad with increasing comfort after 3 weeks of tentative experimentation with what to call his newly discovered father. You're right. I always over-tighten plumbing fixtures. Your mother used to tease me about that when we were teenagers. Mom used to tease you about plumbing? We helped renovate her mother's kitchen the summer before I left for medical school. I insisted I knew what I was doing, and she spent the afternoon pointing out my mistakes with great amusement. You were renovating Grandma's kitchen together? Bella asked from her position at my dining room table, where she was creating a detailed chart of my exercise schedule, dietary requirements, and follow-up appointments. We spent most of our free time together that summer, I explained. Colin was trying to earn money for college by doing handyman work, and I was helping because I enjoyed spending time with him. What else did you do together? Ethan asked, apparently hungry for details about the relationship that had created him but disappeared before he was born. We talked about everything, Colin replied. Your mother was reading constantly and would share opinions about books, current events, philosophy, dreams about the future. What did she want to be when she grew up? Bella asked. A nurse. She was already volunteering at the local hospital and talking about nursing school applications. And what did you want to be? A country doctor. I wanted to practice family medicine in small towns where doctors knew their patients personally. But you became a cardiologist in a major hospital. Because my parents convinced me that specialization in urban medicine was more prestigious and financially rewarding than family practice in rural communities. Do you regret that choice? Colin paused in his faucet repair and looked at me with an expression that suggested he'd been thinking about this question for decades. I regret almost every major decision I made between ages 18 and 30. I chose prestige over relationships, financial security over personal fulfillment, and professional advancement over family connection. But if you'd become a country doctor, you might never have been available to perform Mom's surgery, Ethan pointed out. That's true, but if I'd stayed with your mother, she might never have needed emergency cardiac surgery because she would have had better family support throughout her life. The observation created a moment of uncomfortable reflection about how my children's emotional absence might have contributed to the stress-related health problems that had culminated in my heart attack. Are you saying our behavior contributed to Mom's cardiac event? Bella asked carefully. I'm saying that chronic stress, social isolation, and emotional neglect are significant risk factors for heart disease, especially in older women. Emotional neglect? Children who treat their elderly parents as obligations rather than relationships create conditions of chronic emotional stress that have measurable physiological impacts. I could see my children processing this information with visible discomfort as they realized their treatment of me might have literally contributed to my near-death experience. We didn't mean to neglect you emotionally, Ethan said quietly. I know you didn't mean to. You gradually developed patterns of interaction that prioritized your convenience over my emotional welfare. How do we make sure that doesn't happen again? By continuing to do what you've been doing for the past 3 weeks. Treating me like someone whose thoughts, feelings, and experiences matter to you. Is it working? Bella asked. Do you feel like we're treating you differently? Completely differently. You're calling me because you want to hear about my day, not because you think you should maintain contact. You're visiting because you enjoy spending time here, not because you feel guilty about my health situation. How can you tell the difference? Because you're asking questions about my opinions and experiences instead of just providing updates about your own lives. You're offering help with projects because you notice I need assistance, not because I've specifically requested it. And what about Dad? Ethan asked, glancing at Colin. How are you and Mom figuring out what kind of relationship to have after 36 years? It was the question all of us had been dancing around for 3 weeks, while Colin and I navigated the complex territory between past love, present friendship, and future possibilities. We're taking it slowly, I replied. Your father and I are very different people than we were at 16, and we need time to understand who we've become. But you're attracted to who he is now? Bella pressed with the directness that had characterized her personality since childhood. I'm attracted to his integrity. His commitment to being present for people he cares about, and his willingness to prioritize relationships over professional convenience. Those are the same qualities that attracted you to him when you were teenagers? Those are qualities I'm discovering he's developed as an adult. At 16, he was charming and intelligent, but he hadn't yet learned to value presence over ambition. And now he has learned that? He's demonstrated it consistently for 3 weeks. Whether that represents lasting character development or temporary behavior prompted by guilt and nostalgia remains to be seen. Colin looked up from the kitchen faucet with a slight smile. Your mother has become appropriately cautious about trusting people's promises to change after being disappointed by family members who claimed to prioritize her welfare. Are you talking about us? Ethan asked. I'm talking about anyone who promises to be more present and supportive without demonstrating sustained behavioral change over time. How long do we have to demonstrate sustained behavioral change before you trust that it's authentic? There's no timeline for rebuilding trust, I said. Trust develops gradually through consistency between stated intentions and actual behavior. What if we have work emergencies that interfere with family commitments? Then we'll evaluate your responses to those emergencies and determine whether you've actually changed your priorities or just temporarily adjusted your behavior. That seems like a lot of pressure. Maintaining authentic relationships requires ongoing effort and occasional sacrifice of convenience for connection. If that feels like pressure, it might indicate that changing your fundamental approach to family relationships will be more difficult than you anticipated. Bella finished organizing my medications and moved to join the conversation happening between the kitchen and living room. Mom, what would convince you that our changes are permanent rather than temporary? Sustained consistency over years rather than weeks. Evidence that you've internalized different values about what matters most in life. And what about Dad? What would convince you to consider rebuilding a romantic relationship with him? I looked at Colin, who was watching my face with obvious hope and apprehension. Sustained consistency over years rather than weeks. Evidence that he's internalized different values about what matters most in life. So we're all in the same boat, Ethan observed, trying to prove that we've learned to prioritize relationships over everything else. Exactly. Some families rebuild relationships quickly, through dramatic gestures and emotional declarations. Our family was rebuilding relationships slowly through daily choices that demonstrated whether our stated values aligned with our actual priorities when tested by the ordinary challenges of maintaining consistent connection over time. And all of us were learning that authentic love required ongoing effort that couldn't be sustained through good intentions alone, but needed to be renewed through countless small decisions to show up, pay attention, and treat each other as people whose welfare mattered more than our own convenience. The real test would come when the novelty of our reunited family wore off, and we had to maintain these new patterns without the motivation of crisis, guilt, or the excitement of discovering each other for the first time. 6 months after my heart attack, I was standing in the kitchen of the house Colin and I had just purchased together, our first shared home in 37 years. The decision to move in together had been gradual and carefully considered, based on demonstrated consistency rather than romantic nostalgia or medical convenience. Mom, this kitchen is incredible, Bella said, as she helped me unpack boxes of dishes that represented the merger of two separate lives into something new. The island is perfect for family dinners. That was the idea. Your father and I wanted space for the whole family to gather comfortably. It still feels strange to hear you call him your father so naturally, Ethan observed from his position assembling bar stools at the kitchen island. It feels strange to say it, I admitted, but it's becoming more natural as we all adjust to these new relationship dynamics. Colin entered from the garage carrying the last boxes from the moving truck, looking tired but satisfied with our progress. That's everything from your old house, Tori. How are you feeling about leaving the place where you raised the kids? Ready. That house held a lot of memories, but most of them involved managing everything alone. I'm looking forward to building memories that involve partnership and family connection. What's been the biggest adjustment so far? Bella asked. Learning to make decisions together instead of independently, I replied. For 36 years, I made every choice about living space, finances, and daily routines by myself. Now I have someone who wants to be consulted and included in those decisions. Is that difficult or comfortable? Both. It's comfortable to have someone who cares about my preferences and welfare. It's difficult to remember that I don't have to handle everything alone anymore. Ethan finished assembling his bar stool and tested its stability before sitting down. Dad, what's been the biggest adjustment for you? Learning to balance relationship priorities with professional obligations, Colin replied. For most of my adult life, I've made medical practice my primary focus. Now I have family commitments that sometimes require me to modify my schedule or delegate responsibilities to other physicians. Has that been professionally difficult? Occasionally, but it's also been professionally fulfilling in ways I didn't expect. Having personal relationships that matter more than career advancement has actually made me a better doctor because I'm more empathetic with patients' family situations. How so? When patients' families are struggling to balance work obligations with medical support, I understand their conflicts because I've learned to navigate those tensions myself. Bella opened a box of wedding photographs from my marriage to their father. Pictures I'd saved, but rarely looked at during the decades when Colin's absence had made them too painful to display. Mom, should we put these somewhere in the new house? If you'd like to see them displayed. They're part of our family history now instead of being reminders of what I lost. What changed? Having your father present in our lives changed the meaning of those photographs, from evidence of abandonment to documentation of young love that survived decades of separation. Do you think you and Dad would have stayed married if he hadn't left for medical school? Impossible to know. We were very young, and we both changed significantly during the years we were apart. But you're compatible now. We're compatible now because we've both learned to prioritize relationship maintenance over personal convenience. Colin joined our conversation while arranging books on the shelves we'd installed earlier that week. Your mother and I work well together because we've both experienced the consequences of choosing professional obligations over family connections. What consequences? I missed 36 years with the people I loved most. Your mother spent 36 years managing family responsibilities without the partnership she deserved. And now you both want to do things differently? We both understand that authentic relationships require ongoing attention and occasional sacrifice of other priorities. Speaking of ongoing attention, Ethan said, checking his phone, I need to leave soon for my dinner date, but I wanted to ask about Thanksgiving plans. What about Thanksgiving? I was wondering if we could host it here instead of going to a restaurant like we've done for the past few years. The suggestion surprised me, because my children had preferred restaurant holidays since achieving financial success, claiming that home cooking was too much work and restaurant service was more convenient for everyone. You want to have Thanksgiving dinner here? We want to have a real family Thanksgiving with home cooking, traditional foods, and time to actually talk to each other instead of rushing through a meal at a crowded restaurant. What prompted this change in preference? We realized that all our favorite childhood memories involve family gatherings at home, not restaurant meals. We want to create those kinds of memories for ourselves as adults. Bella nodded in agreement. And we want to participate in the cooking and preparation instead of just showing up to eat. You want to participate in cooking? We want to learn how to host family gatherings ourselves instead of always expecting someone else to handle the work. Those are significant changes in your approach to family events. We've made significant changes in our approach to family relationships generally, Ethan said. These past 6 months have taught us that authentic connection requires personal investment rather than just attendance. What kinds of personal investment? Time, effort, attention to other people's needs and preferences, willingness to prioritize family occasions over work obligations. And those changes feel sustainable rather than temporary? They feel natural now instead of forced. Caring about family welfare feels like the obvious priority instead of feeling like an obligation that conflicts with other interests. Colin looked at our children with obvious pride and satisfaction. 6 months ago, neither of you could drive your mother to the hospital during a medical emergency. Now you're requesting opportunities to host family gatherings and participate in household traditions. 6 months ago, we were selfish people who'd never learned to value relationships over professional success, Bella replied. Now we're people who understand that career achievements are meaningless without family connections to share them with. What created that change in understanding? Almost losing Mom created immediate shock and guilt, but discovering you created long-term motivation to become the kind of people who deserve authentic family relationships. How so? Meeting a father who'd spent 36 years prioritizing the family he'd lost made us realize we were in danger of losing the family we had through the same kind of selfish choices. You're saying that learning about my regrets influenced your decisions about relationship priorities? We're saying that seeing how much you valued what you'd missed made us recognize the value of what we still had the opportunity to build. I watched this conversation between Colin and my children with amazement that 6 months of consistent effort had transformed our family dynamics so completely. What are your hopes for our family moving forward? I asked. Regular gatherings that everyone genuinely enjoys attending, Ethan replied. Conversations where everyone feels heard and valued. Support during challenges that doesn't feel obligatory. And shared experiences that create positive memories instead of stress and resentment, Bella added. Those are beautiful goals. What makes you confident we can achieve them? 6 months of evidence that all of us are capable of prioritizing relationships over convenience when we make that choice consciously and consistently. Some families are brought together by tragedy and gradually drift apart as the crisis passes. Our family had been brought together by near tragedy and had grown stronger through sustained effort to prioritize each other's welfare over individual convenience. The real success wasn't that we'd survived my heart attack or navigated the discovery of Colin's identity. The real success was that we'd learned to choose each other repeatedly in small daily decisions that demonstrated authentic care rather than obligatory connection. And standing in our new kitchen, surrounded by evidence of conscious commitment to building something genuine together, I felt more optimistic about our family's future than I had in decades. 1 year after my heart attack, I was standing in the Cardiac Rehabilitation Center, where I now volunteered twice a week, helping other heart attack survivors navigate their recovery while their families learned what mine had learned about the difference between obligation and authentic support. "Mrs. Matthews," said Janet, a 73-year-old woman whose children had reacted to her cardiac event with the same dismissive concern my children had initially shown. "How did you get your family to understand that you needed real help, not just advice about hiring professionals?" "I got lucky in the worst possible way," I replied, adjusting the name tag that reflected my recent marriage to Colin. My heart attack revealed problems in our family relationships that we'd been ignoring for years, and nearly losing each other forced us to confront those problems honestly. Lucky how? Lucky because my surgeon turned out to be someone who cared enough about my welfare to demand that my children examine their behavior and their priorities. "Your surgeon knew your family?" "My surgeon was my children's father, who'd spent 36 years trying to find us after circumstances forced him to abandon me during my pregnancy." "Oh my goodness, what were the chances of that coincidence?" "Apparently exactly the chances we needed for our family to be forced into the kind of honest conversations that we'd been avoiding for decades." Janet's daughter, Patricia, was listening to our conversation from the chair where she sat reading magazines during her mother's therapy sessions, reading magazines instead of participating in the educational programs designed to help families support cardiac recovery effectively. "Mrs. Matthews, can I ask you something personal?" Patricia interrupted. "Of course. Do you think your children's behavior before your heart attack was actually as bad as you've described? Or do you think medical trauma made you more sensitive to normal family dynamics?" The question revealed exactly the kind of defensive thinking that prevented families from addressing authentic relationship problems. "Patricia, do you think telling your mother to take an Uber to the hospital during a cardiac emergency represents normal family dynamics?" "Well, no, but maybe they genuinely thought she was overreacting to anxiety symptoms." "Based on what evidence? Do you know your mother's medical history well enough to distinguish between her legitimate health concerns and anxiety-related worries?" Not really." "Do you know what medications she takes, what symptoms she's experienced recently, or what her doctors have told her about cardiac risk factors?" "No." "So you're defending my children's dismissive response to my medical emergency while acknowledging that you're equally uninformed about your own mother's health situation?" Patricia looked uncomfortable as she recognized the parallel between her family's dynamics and the story I'd been sharing. "I suppose I am." "Patricia, the question isn't whether medical trauma made me more sensitive to family dynamics. The question is whether medical trauma finally forced me to acknowledge family dynamics that had been problematic for years." "What's the difference?" "The difference is whether I was overreacting to isolated incidents or finally responding appropriately to patterns of behavior that had been damaging our relationships gradually over time." Colin appeared in the doorway of the rehabilitation center, arriving to pick me up after my volunteer shift ended. "Hello, everyone. How's today's session going?" "Dr. Matthews, we were discussing how families learn to provide authentic support during cardiac recovery instead of just offering advice that doesn't require personal involvement," I explained. "That's one of the most important aspects of successful recovery," he agreed, settling into a chair near Janet and Patricia. "Family members who understand that recovery requires presence rather than problem-solving tend to have better long-term outcomes." "What do you mean by presence rather than problem-solving?" Patricia asked. "Presence means spending time with patients because you want to support their emotional welfare, not because you're trying to fix their situation efficiently." "And problem-solving?" Problem solving means offering solutions that remove the patient's concerns from your sphere of responsibility rather than providing ongoing personal support. Can you give us an example? When Tori was discharged from the hospital, her children could have hired a home health aide to check on her daily, or they could have arranged their schedules to visit personally and provide companionship during her recovery. What did they choose? They chose to visit personally because they recognized that their mother needed emotional connection, not just medical supervision. And that made a difference in her recovery? It made a difference in her willingness to comply with rehabilitation requirements and her overall psychological adjustment to life after a cardiac event. Janet looked at her daughter with an expression that suggested she was recognizing problems in their own family dynamic. Patricia, when was the last time you visited me because you wanted my company rather than because you felt obligated to check on my welfare? Mom, I visit you every week. That's not what I asked. When was the last time you visited because you genuinely wanted to spend time with me? Patricia was quiet for several minutes before answering honestly. I'm not sure I can remember a specific time. That's what I thought. But I do care about your welfare, Mom. I know you care about my welfare, but caring about someone's welfare isn't the same as enjoying their company or valuing their presence in your life. Colin and I exchanged glances, recognizing the conversation we'd had with Ethan and Bella during my recovery period. Janet, Patricia, would you like to hear about how our family learned to transform obligation-based relationships into connection-based relationships? I offered. Please, Janet said immediately. We started by acknowledging that good intentions aren't sufficient for maintaining authentic relationships. Caring about someone and wanting to spend time with them are different emotional experiences that require different kinds of attention. What kinds of attention? Caring about someone means monitoring their welfare and providing assistance when needed. Wanting to spend time with someone means enjoying their personality and feeling enriched by conversations and shared experiences. And your children learn to do both? They learn that sustainable family relationships require both. You can't maintain long-term connection based solely on caregiving obligations, and you can't provide effective support if you don't genuinely enjoy the person you're trying to help. How did they learn that? Through sustained practice over months, not through dramatic revelations or emotional conversations. They had to experience the difference between visiting me because they felt guilty and visiting me because they wanted my company. What was the difference? When they visited because they felt guilty, our time together felt forced and artificial. When they visited because they wanted my company, our conversations became natural and enjoyable. And how could you tell which motivation was driving their visits? Time and consistency. Guilt-motivated attention fades as the crisis that prompted it becomes less immediate. Genuine affection, motivated attention deepens as relationships become more authentic. I asked my children to take me to the hospital when I could barely breathe from chest pain. They yawned and said, "Call an Uber, Mom. We have work tomorrow." I went alone and discovered I was having a massive heart attack. 6 hours later, my cardiologist called them and said, "You need to come now. She might not survive." When they arrived at the ICU, they learned that the doctor who'd saved my life was their father, the man who'd been searching for us for 36 years while they were too busy with work meetings to drive their mother to the hospital during a medical emergency. That phone call didn't just save my life, it taught my children that some work meetings aren't worth losing your family over. 2 years later, I was no longer Tori Ashworth, the abandoned single mother whose children treated her welfare as secondary to their professional obligations. I was Tori Matthews, married to a man who demonstrated that authentic love means showing up consistently, mother to children who'd learned that meaningful relationships require prioritizing presence over convenience, and volunteer counselor helping other families navigate the difference between obligation and genuine connection. Some medical emergencies destroy families by revealing insurmountable dysfunction and resentment. My medical emergency had rebuilt our family by forcing all of us to confront the difference between loving someone and actually valuing their presence in our daily lives. And every evening when Colin came home from the hospital and my children called because they genuinely wanted to hear about my day, rather than because they felt obligated to maintain contact, I felt grateful that nearly dying had taught all of us how to actually live together as people who chose each other repeatedly rather than simply endured each other out of biological obligation. The heart attack that almost killed me had actually saved our family by revealing that love without presence is just a beautiful theory, while presence with love creates the kind of authentic connection that makes life worth living, even after medical crises remind us how fragile that life actually is. The end.